At 11:14 a.m. on May 10, 1945, First Lieutenant Robert Klingman climbed to 38,000 feet over Okinawa with one target in sight: a Japanese Ki-45 Nick on a high-altitude reconnaissance run. Klingman was 28 and had already flown 43 combat missions since reaching Kadena Airfield 6 weeks earlier. His F4U Corsair was now about 3,000 feet above its rated ceiling, in air so thin it could kill a man and stall a fighter with a single careless movement. The Nick lived in that thin air. It could cruise around 35,000 feet, sweeping over the American fleet to photograph ship positions for the Kamikaze planners. In the previous week, suicide attacks had already sent a dozen ships under, and every recon pass meant the next strike would be more accurate. That morning, the Japanese aircraft managed 2 clean runs over the fleet before turning for home, high enough to be out of reach of anti-aircraft fire, and usually too high for fighters to catch. VMF-312 knew what those photos meant. The squadron had lost pilots to kamikaze attacks in April, and Okinawa had become a slaughterhouse in the air and on the sea. Reconnaissance flights were the quiet beginning of the worst days. Snap the pictures, pass the coordinates, vanish back toward Japanese airspace before anyone could get up to their altitude. Klingman had been on combat air patrol since 9:40 a.m., launched from Kadena with 3 other Corsairs. The flight was led by Captain Kenneth Royer Rooser. A little before 10:40, radar called out a contact coming from the north at roughly 25,000 feet. Rooser ordered the climb immediately, then told the pilots to ditch anything that kept them from gaining altitude. Drop the belly tanks, lighten the load, even burn off ammunition if it meant reaching the intruder. Klingman obeyed. He sent roughly 2,000 rounds into the empty ocean, shedding hundreds of pounds in half a minute just to make his Corsair claw upward faster. It helped, but not enough. As they climbed through the 20s, the air thinned and engines began to complain. 2 pilots, Captain Jim Cox and Second Lieutenant Frank Watson, reported rough running and couldn't keep pushing. Reiser sent them back down to cover the fleet. The Nick completed its second pass and then angled north, heading for safety. Now only Rooser and Klingman stayed on it. Both went to maximum emergency power and drove their Corsairs past design limits. Temperatures climbed into the red and kept rising. An engine failure at that altitude would be sudden and final. Even at the Corsair's published ceiling, around 36,000 feet, the fighter wasn't meant to maneuver hard. They kept climbing anyway. 37,000. 38,000. Control surfaces growing sluggish, the aircraft responding like it was moving through syrup. A sharp turn could trigger a stall. A stall up there could become an unrecoverable spin. No recovery, no bailout. Just a long fall. They inched closer. Reuser got within range first and fired what he had left. His rounds punched into the Nick's right engine. Flames blew out from the cowling, and the Japanese aircraft slowed, but it didn't fall. It kept flying on the remaining engine. Reuser ran his guns dry and slid aside. Klingman moved into position about 50 feet behind the Nick. The Japanese rear gunner swung a Type 98 machine gun toward him. Tracers tore into Klingman's right wing, but he stayed in the slot, held the line, and squeezed his trigger. Nothing. At 38,000 feet, the cold had locked his .50 caliber guns solid. He'd already dumped most of his ammunition to climb, and what remained might as well have been blocks of ice and useless steel. The Nick began pulling away again, smoking from the wounded engine, but still airborne, still capable of carrying those photographs home to the coordinators who would assign targets for the next day's kamikaze strikes. Klingman had been climbing for around 90 minutes. He'd pushed his Corsair beyond its ceiling, beyond what the engineers promised it could do, and he was running out of time. If the Nick escaped, the mission failed. He had one last option, and it wasn't in any manual. He decided in seconds. He shoved the throttle forward, climbed above the Nick, and called Reuser on the radio with a short warning. Then he committed to the unthinkable. He would use his propeller as his weapon. In air that barely supported flight, with his guns frozen and the enemy still firing, Klingman angled down toward the Nick's tail. His four-bladed Hamilton standard propeller was spinning at about 2,000 RPM, his only gun left. The rear gunner fired wildly. Bullets ripped more holes through the Corsair's right wing fabric. Klingman didn't flinch. He closed the gap, 20 feet, 15, 10, until the Knick's tail filled his windscreen. The first contact came at roughly 300 miles per hour. Metal hit metal. The spinning blades bit into the Knick's rudder, chewing aluminum and throwing shards past Klingman's canopy. The Japanese aircraft jolted and shuddered, but it stayed in the air. Klingman pulled up and felt his own Corsair begin to shake. A damaged propeller doesn't just wobble, it beats an aircraft like a hammer. Vibrations surged through the airframe. Temperatures rose further. He knew he had only minutes before his engine tore itself apart. Below and ahead, the Knick's gunner pivoted toward Reuser, trying to drive the second Corsair off. Klingman rolled back in for a second pass, diving into the disturbed air behind the target. This time, the propeller tore into the rear cockpit canopy area. The gun mount broke away, and in the chaos, the gunner and his weapon vanished into the slipstream. Even then, the Knick kept flying level on its remaining engine. Klingman climbed again with two prop blades now damaged and an overheating engine that was close to quitting. For the third attack, he came from directly above. He pushed the nose over, lined up with the base of the vertical stabilizer, and struck again. The damaged propeller hit hard. There was a shriek of tearing metal, and the Knick's tail assembly separated from the fuselage. The Japanese aircraft immediately pitched forward into an uncontrolled dive. Pieces tumbled away as it spun toward the Pacific far below. No parachutes appeared. The crew went down with their photographs and the reconnaissance data. This flight would deliver nothing to the strike planners. Klingman's Corsair, however, was now a barely controlled vibration. The third impact had bent two propeller blades back toward the cowling, and a section of another blade had been ripped off. The propeller was so unbalanced, the control stick bucked in his hands. The whole airframe groaned. Instruments blurred. He pulled the power back toward idle, and the shaking eased slightly, but not enough to feel safe. He worked the rudder pedals with extreme care. At that altitude, any abrupt control input could worsen everything. Slowly, with opposite rudder and gentle corrections, he stabilized the aircraft and brought the nose up. Level flight returned, but the Corsair handled as if it had structural damage, and the cylinder head temperature sat pinned at the top of the red. Oil pressure started dropping. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 had been held at emergency power for nearly 2 hours at an altitude it was never designed to endure. Every part of that engine was overstressed. Failure wasn't a possibility. It was a countdown. Klingman pointed south toward Kadena, about 70 miles away, and nursed the Corsair down through the thin air. Reuser slid onto his wing. Neither man had much to say on the radio. They both understood the math. A damaged fighter with a ruined propeller might not make it home. As Klingman descended through 20,000 feet, his fuel gauge was nearly empty. The long climb had burned fuel at the worst possible rate. He estimated what was left. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe less, and he needed about 15 minutes to reach the field at his current power setting and descent profile. There was no margin. Then black smoke began streaming from the cowling, thin, oily smoke, not open flame. A seal inside the engine had failed, and oil was leaking onto hot metal. Without lubrication, the engine would seize, the prop would stop, and he'd be forced into a dead-stick landing with a propeller that might not even windmill properly. Around 10,000 feet, he finally had Okinawa in sight. Kadena sat on the western coast, its runway long enough for normal landings, but normal didn't apply now. He had a damaged prop creating unpredictable drag, a failing engine, and one shot to get it onto concrete. Reuser called the tower and reported the emergency. Crash crews rolled out, fire trucks and ambulances positioned along the approach. Everyone knew what a ruined propeller could do on touchdown. In the worst cases, it could tear an engine from its mounts and send it tumbling toward the cockpit. Pilots had been killed that way. At 5,000 feet, the engine coughed. The fuel gauge brushed empty. Klingman switched to reserve and got nothing. He'd burned the reserve during the climb. The engine sputtered again as smoke thickened. Power fell off and the prop began to windmill. 3 miles from the runway, he adjusted his glide path, but the drag from the damaged prop was hard to predict. The Corsair didn't fly like anything he'd trained for. He dropped the landing gear manually. The hydraulics had enough pressure for a single extension, and the wheels locked down. Then, at about 1,000 feet, the engine quit completely. The prop stopped. The cockpit went silent except for wind over the wings. Klingman trimmed for best glide, about 85 knots, and aimed for the runway threshold. He planned to touch down and brake as hard as the aircraft would allow. The alternative was rough ground short of the runway. But at 500 feet, he realized he was still high. The Corsair would float past the threshold and eat up precious runway. He slipped the aircraft to lose altitude. The damaged prop caught the wind the wrong way, yawing the nose. He corrected with rudder, held the slip, and watched the threshold slide beneath him. The wheels touched down far past where he wanted, roughly 800 feet beyond the threshold, leaving about 2,800 feet to stop. He stood on the brakes. The Corsair slowed, but not like a Corsair should. A normal windmilling prop can help create drag. His locked prop did nothing. The end of the runway rushed closer, 1,800 feet, 1,400, 1,000. The aircraft still rolling fast enough to make the crash crews pace him. He pumped the brakes, tires smoking on concrete, and forced the last bit of speed out, 30 knots, 20. The runway end approaching. The Corsair finally stopped with only a few hundred feet remaining. Klingman shut down what systems he could. His hands were shaking. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft and stared at the propeller. 2 blades bent back toward the cowling and a chunk missing from another. The wing was peppered with bullet holes. Oil coated the engine. The fighter looked like it had been through a grinder. Maintenance teams inspected it and declared it beyond repair. The engine was ruined. The propeller was unusable. The airframe had stress damage throughout. They would strip it for parts and scrap what remained. Klingman had brought down an enemy reconnaissance aircraft and, in the process, essentially destroyed his own Corsair. Intelligence officers debriefed him immediately. Regulations required a pilot statement quickly after combat, and Klingman recounted the entire sequence: the climb to extreme altitude, the guns freezing, the decision to attack with the propeller, the 3 passes, the tail coming off, the enemy diving with no parachute seen. The kill was confirmed, and Hoysa had witnessed the outcome. The Nix crew and their reconnaissance photographs were gone. The coordinators would receive no data from that flight, and the fleet would not be targeted using those images. Against every limit of aircraft design and every rule of high-altitude engagement, the mission succeeded. 2 days later, Klingman suffered a hydraulic failure on another mission and had to bail out over the ocean. A destroyer picked him up after about half an hour in the water. He returned to Kadena and flew again the next day. But what happened on May 10th became the action that defined his war. At 38,000 feet, with frozen guns and no conventional options left, he turned his aircraft itself into a weapon. Klingman had been born on January 12, 1917, in Binger, Oklahoma, one of 9 children. The Great Depression hit his family hard, and in the summer of 1934, his parents sent him to Fort Sill for a civilian military training program that fed and clothed participants for a month, relief for families that needed it. He learned discipline there and realized he wanted a life in uniform. That August, at 17, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and went through basic training at Parris Island. He was assigned to Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C., serving as a drummer in a ceremonial unit. For 4 years, he sent much of his pay back home to his mother. He left active service in 1938, returned to Oklahoma, and tried to make a living running a small burger cafe that barely stayed afloat. In 1940, his brother urged him to enlist again, this time in the Navy, where the pay and prospects were better. Klingman joined up and reported to USS Tennessee as an aircraft maintenance mechanic. He advanced quickly to first class. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck and Tennessee took bomb hits. Klingman was ashore at San Diego at the time, finishing carrier training while his ship burned. He completed carrier operations training in September 1942. Soon after, he was discharged to the inactive reserve and selected for aviation cadet training. He was 25, older than most cadets, who were often 19 or 20, and he had to work harder to keep up. He finished in the top 10% of his pre-flight class and went on to flight training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. Klingman finished flight school, earned his commission as a Marine second lieutenant, and was sent to Marine Fighter Squadron 312 at Parris Island. There he transitioned onto the F4U Corsair, a powerful fighter that was still proving itself in carrier operations. The Navy leaned toward the more forgiving F6F Hellcat, while the Marines relied heavily on Corsairs for land-based fighting. VMF-312 trained for roughly 6 months, then shipped out to the Pacific in March 1945. The squadron reached Kadena Airfield in early April, only days after American forces captured it during the opening phase of the Okinawa invasion. The island was still burning with resistance, and the campaign would stretch into an 82-day fight that became the longest and bloodiest of the Pacific War. The human cost was staggering. About 12,000 Americans killed, roughly 77,000 Japanese dead, and an estimated 150,000 Okinawan civilians lost. For the Navy, the air threat felt even worse than the ground battle. Kamikaze pilots didn't need a perfect attack run or a second pass. They only had to connect once. A single fighter carrying a 500-pound bomb could turn itself into a guided missile, and destroyers and carriers could be set ablaze from one impact. Japan called these missions Special Attack Units, Tokotai. American sailors called them kamikazes, the divine wind. From April 1st through June 22nd, Japan launched around 1,900 individual kamikaze sorties against the U.S. fleet off Okinawa. They sank 36 ships, damaged hundreds more, and killed roughly 5,000 American sailors, with thousands wounded. And behind many of those strikes was an unglamorous but critical step: reconnaissance. High-altitude Japanese NIC aircraft often flew above what American fighters could reliably fight at. Twice a day, morning and afternoon, they photographed fleet positions. Those images and coordinates went to special attack coordinators, who could assign targets with deadly specificity. A destroyer at one grid, a carrier at another. The kamikaze pilots didn't have to search. They could navigate straight to a marked point on the ocean. American fighters struggled to stop those reconnaissance runs. The Hellcat's published ceiling approached 38,000 feet, but combat capability up there was another matter. The Corsair was rated around 36,000, and even reaching that altitude at intercept speed was a painful climb. Often, the NICs finished their passes and slipped away before the Americans could get close. VMF-312 felt the pressure immediately. The squadron lost 4 pilots to kamikaze action in April, not always from direct hits, but from the chaos those attacks created. Operating from Kadena didn't mean safety. The airfield itself was attacked. Fighters scrambled repeatedly. Some pilots never came back. The special attacks killed Americans on the sea and on land, and they disrupted operations constantly. Klingman flew his first combat mission on April 8th, a combat air patrol over the fleet with no enemy contact. 2 days later, he was up again during a kamikaze interception and shot down a Zero. On April 14th, he shifted to ground support in southern Okinawa and fired rockets into Japanese positions. Routine combat tasks, dangerous, but familiar. By May 10th, he had flown 43 combat missions in 32 days, about 1 a day on average, sometimes 2. He had 3 confirmed kills by then, 2 Zeros and 1 reconnaissance aircraft that had been caught at a lower altitude. Standard threats, standard targets. Nothing like the problem that would unfold that morning. At the 8:30 briefing, the plan sounded ordinary. 4 Corsairs would fly a ship combat air patrol, altitude 13,000 feet, a station roughly 10 miles north of Kadena. Captain Kenneth Rooser would lead. Klingman would fly as wingman, and 2 more Corsairs would back them up. They expected the usual, maybe intercept a kamikaze, maybe never see an enemy, then head home. No one stood up in that room and promised them a solution to the high nick problem. That changed when radar picked up a contact at 10:37, a bogey from the north around 25,000 feet heading south at roughly 220 knots. The profile fit a reconnaissance aircraft, and Reuser decided instantly they would go after it. They would climb beyond normal operating altitude and try to end that flight before it could feed the next wave of attacks. 4 Corsairs shoved their throttles forward and pitched up from 13,000. The F4U could climb hard at first. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was an 18-cylinder brute pushing around 2,000 horsepower. Initially, the climb rate was strong, roughly 4,000 feet per minute, but every pound and every bit of drag mattered as they went higher. Around 15,000 feet, Reuser ordered them to drop external fuel tanks. The belly tanks gave range, but they also stole climb performance. 4 tanks fell away and tumbled toward the ocean, and the Corsairs began to claw upward a little faster. At about 18,000 feet, Reuser gave the next order: dump ammunition to cut weight. Klingman pressed the trigger, and all 6 Browning M2s, 3 in each wing, spat .50 caliber rounds at a furious rate. He held it down for roughly 40 seconds, firing around 2,000 rounds into empty water. The weight loss was dramatic, hundreds of pounds gone in moments. The other pilots did the same. In about 2 minutes, roughly 12,000 rounds disappeared into the Pacific, traded away for altitude. It was a brutal bargain, but the Nick wasn't a fighter. It was lightly armed and built to run, not dogfight. The Americans needed height more than bullets. As they climbed, the air thinned, engines strained, and fuel consumption rose. Superchargers had to work harder to cram thin air into the cylinders, and that extra work burned fuel fast. With their external tanks gone, they were now living on internal fuel, enough for a limited window at these power settings. At around 22,000 feet, 2 pilots started having engine trouble. Captain Jim Cox reported rough running, temperatures rising, and oil pressure acting wrong. Second Lieutenant Frank Watson reported similar issues moments later. They were still thousands of feet below the Nick, and Reuser had to make a cold decision. He ordered Cox and Watson back down to protect the fleet. Only 2 Corsairs would continue the chase, Reuser and Klingman. The timing was tight. The Nick was finishing its 2nd reconnaissance pass and then turned north for home. If it reached Japanese airspace with its photographs intact, tomorrow's attacks would launch with better information. Reuser and Klingman pushed to maximum emergency power, past normal limits. The throttle had a wire safety designed to keep pilots from going beyond standard maximum. Both men broke that safety and shoved forward anyway. Emergency war power could be tolerated briefly, but this would take more than a few minutes. The gauges punished them for it. Cylinder head temperatures rose into the red. Oil temperatures followed. The superchargers screamed as they tried to feed the engines with ever thinner air. The longer they held this, the more certain it became that something inside the engine would fail. It wasn't a question of if, only when. At 25,000 feet, they finally spotted the Nick, a dark fleck against the blue several miles ahead, still climbing. The Japanese crew had seen the pursuers and was running for home at full speed. The Ki-45 had less total horsepower than a Corsair, but it was designed to live higher than most fighters. The climb turned into a slow-motion knife fight against physics. Above 30,000 feet, the Corsairs began to feel soft and sluggish. Control response faded as the air thinned. Any abrupt maneuver risked a stall, and a stall up there could mean an unrecoverable spin. Too thin for recovery, too high for survival. So they kept their hands gentle, their turns smooth, their movements measured. and they kept climbing. The Nick reached 35,000. Reuser and Klingman followed. Minutes became longer than they should have at emergency power. 10, 15, 20. Temperatures stayed buried in the red. Oil pressure flickered. Then they reached the Corsair's published ceiling, around 36,000 feet, and the Nick still climbed. 37,000. The Corsairs followed. 38,000, roughly 3,000 feet beyond what the design numbers promised, and at last, the distance began to close. The Nick was still about a mile ahead, but now it was within the realm of gun range. Reuser had a slight speed edge and reached firing position first. He lined up on the Nick's tail as the rear gunner swung a Type 98 toward him. Reuser fired what he had left. His rounds tore into the Nick's right engine. The cowling shredded, flame burst out, and thick smoke poured behind it. The Nick slowed, but it did not fall. It kept flying on one engine. The rear gunner fired back. Tracers arced toward Reuser's Corsair, and he broke away to avoid taking hits as his guns ran dry. He was out. That left Klingman. Klingman slid into the perfect position, about 50 feet behind the Nick's tail. The rear gunner pivoted and fired. Bullets punched through Klingman's right wing, ripping fabric and snapping metal. Klingman held steady, lined up, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. He squeezed again, still nothing. At 38,000 feet, his guns had frozen solid. After a climb that had eaten 90 minutes of fuel and pushed his engine beyond anything it was designed to endure, he had finally reached the target, only to discover his weapons were useless. In that instant, the choices were brutal. Turn back, and the Nick escapes with its photographs. Let it deliver the data, and the next day's Kamikaze wave flies with better aim. Or stop it here, somehow, before it slips away. He could ram the aircraft outright, drive his Corsair into the Japanese fuselage and guarantee both crews died while the reconnaissance data sank with them. It would work, but it felt like a special attack solution, not the one he came here to make. There had to be another way to kill the plane without sacrificing himself. Then he looked at what still worked, the propeller. A 4-bladed Hamilton Standard unit, more than 13 feet across, spinning at roughly 2,000 revolutions per minute, an engine-driven saw. If the blade tips could slice through aluminum and control surfaces, he might not need guns at all. Klingman advanced power, climbed above the Nick, and called Reuser with his plan. He would use the propeller as a weapon and go for the tail, cut the control surfaces, break the aircraft's stability, force it into a fatal dive. Reuser didn't argue. He moved his Corsair to the Nick's side to draw the rear gunner's attention and help keep the fire off Klingman's approach. From about 200 feet above the Nick, Klingman tipped into a shallow dive. In that thin air, acceleration came slowly, but the distance closed. 150 feet. 100. 50. The rear gunner saw him and swung the machine gun upward. Muzzle flashes flickered. Tracers reached out. More rounds struck Klingman's right wing. Fabric tore again. The airframe rang with impacts. Klingman didn't flinch. He aimed for the vertical stabilizer, the fin and rudder at the tail, because if he could destroy that, the Nick would lose control. 20 feet. 15. 10. The spinning propeller disc filled his view, a whirling circle wide enough to devour the tail. The first strike came with a violent grind, metal on metal tearing and shrieking. The blades bit into the rudder and chewed through aluminum skin. Shards of metal exploded outward. Some fragments hit the Corsair's windscreen, leaving cracks spidering through the glass. The Nick jolted and shuddered, but it stayed airborne. The tail had been damaged, not severed. Klingman pulled up to set up a second attempt, and his Corsair immediately began to shake hard. At least one propeller blade was bent now, and the imbalance sent brutal vibration through the entire aircraft. The control stick kicked in his hands as the engine continued to run hot and strained. His instrument panel turned into a smear of needles and colored arcs. The vibration was so violent he could barely make out the gauges, and the cylinder head temperature kept climbing as if the engine were trying to melt its own insides. Behind the Nick, The rear gunner shifted his fire toward Captain Reusser's Corsair, the easier target. Reusser jinked right, the gunner followed the movement, and that split-second distraction gave Klingman his opening. Klingman rolled in again. This time, he didn't aim at the rudder. He aimed at the rear cockpit, at the gun position itself. He steepened the dive. The damaged propeller screamed as it spun up. The shaking grew worse, and the entire airframe seemed to groan under the strain. He fought the controls just to keep the nose where he needed it. At the last moment, the gunner finally realized what was coming. Through the canopy glass, Klingman could see a face, young, maybe 20, and terrified. There was no time to fire. The Corsair's propeller hit the rear canopy like a circular saw. Glass detonated outward. Metal tore and peeled. The gun mount ripped free, and then the gun and the gunner were simply gone, torn into the slipstream at roughly 300 miles per hour and swallowed by the thin air. When Klingman pulled up, the Knick's rear cockpit was no longer a cockpit at all, just a jagged hole in the fuselage. But the aircraft still held level flight on its remaining engine. Klingman climbed for one last attempt and saw the truth of what he'd done to his own plane. Two prop blades were bent so far back they nearly pointed toward the engine cowling. Another blade was missing several inches off the tip, cleanly sheared. The fourth was still there, but cracked and mangled. The vibration was now catastrophic. His engine was seconds from failing, and the propeller couldn't take another mistake, so he set it up perfectly. He climbed above the Knick one final time, positioned directly over the tail, and pushed the nose down into a near-vertical dive for maximum speed. The propeller howled like it was coming apart. The Knick's pilot tried to maneuver, but at that altitude the aircraft couldn't react fast enough. Klingman came straight down and struck at the weakest point, the base of the tail where it joined the fuselage. The sound wasn't a thud. It was a shriek. Aluminum ripped. The entire tail assembly separated in an instant. The Knick pitched forward immediately, no tail, no control, then began tumbling as pieces broke away. The fuselage spun and fell toward the Pacific 15,000 feet below. No parachutes appeared. The pilot and the remaining crew went down with the reconnaissance photographs and the data that would have guided the next kamikaze wave. But Klingman's Corsair paid the price right away. After that third impact, the propeller was essentially destroyed and the aircraft snapped into its own violent spin. At 38,000 feet, with an engine that was failing and a propeller that no longer behaved like a propeller, normal recovery steps didn't fit the situation. The world rotated. Sky, ocean, sky, ocean. The damaged blades created uneven drag, and the spin tightened as if the aircraft wanted to drill straight down. Klingman had to invent the solution as he went. He yanked the throttle back to idle. The prop stopped windmilling, and the worst of the asymmetric forces eased. He stomped full opposite rudder. The spin slowed but didn't break. He pushed the stick forward to build airspeed because more speed meant more control authority. The nose dropped and the aircraft began to respond again. The spin didn't vanish, but it degraded into something less lethal. By around 36,000 feet, he had partial control. The pure spin became a spiraling descent, still dropping but no longer a violent corkscrew. He centered the pedals, eased the stick back carefully, and fought the instinct to pull too hard. One overcorrection could stall the aircraft again. The nose came up gradually. The spiral flattened into a descending turn. By roughly 34,000 feet, he finally achieved level flight. Now he looked at what he had left. The propeller hung ruined on the shaft. Two blades bent backward, one missing its tip, the last cracked along its length. The whole assembly was unbalanced. Restarting the engine would tear it apart, if the engine could even run. He was committed to a dead-stick glide. Tadena was about 70 miles away. He was starting from roughly 34,000 feet with a glide ratio around 12-1. The math barely worked, and the fuel gauge read empty. He'd burned fuel at maximum rate for 2 hours. He tried switching tanks, main, reserve, auxiliary, nothing. all dry. The engine was cold and dead, and even if he wanted to restart it, there was nothing to feed it. Oil pressure sat at 0. The engine had pumped its last oil during the fight. Seals had failed under extreme heat and stress, and the leaking oil had been the black smoke he'd seen earlier. Without lubrication, even a cold engine could seize. But at this point it didn't matter. The propeller was destroyed. The engine would never power him again. Reuser formed up on Klingman's wing. His own Corsair ran smooth, undamaged, with fuel to spare. Regulations demanded quick confirmation of aerial victories, but Reuser stayed anyway. He wasn't leaving his wingman alone. As Klingman descended through 20,000 feet, he started treating the glide like a constant equation. He needed to reach Kadena with at least 1,000 feet of altitude, enough to enter the pattern, line up, and still have options. Too low and he'd crash short. Too high and he might have to circle to lose altitude, and circling without power was a gamble with no reset button. The wind complicated everything. It was blowing from the east around 15 knots, pushing him west during descent. He adjusted heading to compensate, knowing the headwind on final would reduce ground speed during landing. That helped touchdown, but it also stole glide range. He kept recalculating. At roughly 15,000 feet, Okinawa came into view, brown and green beneath him. Kadena sat on the western coast. He could see the runway as a thin gray strip about 3,600 feet long and 150 feet wide. Plenty for a routine landing. Not generous for a powerless emergency with a ruined prop creating unpredictable drag. Reuser broke radio silence and called the tower. Emergency inbound, 1 Corsair, no engine power, damaged propeller, priority landing requested, clear the runway and roll the equipment. The tower acknowledged. Fire trucks moved, ambulances started up. Everyone prepared for a crash that might cartwheel a fighter at high speed. At around 10,000 feet, Klingman reached for the gear. The hydraulics had only residual pressure left, maybe enough for 1 extension. He pulled the handle. Nothing. He tried again. Then the nose gear dropped and locked. Green light. The right main followed. Green light. The left main stopped halfway. Red light. He cycled the handle. Still stuck. Tried again. Still stuck. Hydraulic pressure was too low. He was going in with 2 wheels locked and 1 questionable leg that might collapse on impact. That changed the entire landing. On touchdown, the aircraft would want to pull left. He'd need heavy right rudder to keep it straight. If the left gear gave way, the wing would drop, the plane could cartwheel, and pilots rarely survived that. At 5,000 feet, the approach still looked workable. He thought he'd crossed the threshold with a bit of altitude to spare, enough to finesse the final seconds. But the weather shifted again. The wind strengthened from the northeast at around 20 knots. The stronger headwind reduced glide range. His extra altitude vanished in the calculations. Now he expected to reach the threshold at closer to 200 feet. The margin was nearly gone. 3 miles out at 2,000 feet, he could see the emergency vehicles staged along the runway and personnel watching from the sides. 1 mile out, at 1,000 feet, he aligned with centerline and held a steady descent. The air was smooth, no turbulence, no wind shear, about as perfect as it ever gets for a powerless landing. But the left gear light stayed red. 500 feet. Half a mile. The threshold coming fast. 1 attempt, no go-around. He held best glide around 85 knots and let the runway rise toward him. 100 feet. 75. 50. The damaged gear could still fold. At 20 feet, he flared slightly. The nose came up and airspeed bled off. The nose wheel touched first, gentle. The right main touched, solid. The left main hit last, still red, still suspect, but it held. All 3 wheels were on concrete. Now it was just braking. No engine thrust, no propeller drag, only tires and friction. The Corsair slowed from about 70 knots as the end of the runway approached. 2,800 feet remaining, 2,400, 2,000. He hammered the brakes harder. Tires smoked. 40 knots, 30, 20. Crashed trucks raced alongside, 1,000 feet left, 800, 600. The Corsair crawled down to 15 knots, then 10, and finally stopped with roughly 320 feet of runway still in front of him. Klingman shut down the electrics. His hands shook. 2 hours spent beyond every limit a pilot was taught to respect. And he was alive. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft and stared at the propeller. 2 blades bent back into the cowling, a chunk missing from another. The last twisted and cracked. Bullet holes riddled the wing. Oil coated the engine. The Corsair looked like it should have fallen out of the sky. The maintenance chief, an experienced Marine with decades in uniform, walked around it, checked the engine and mounts, examined the propeller hub, inspected wing structure and landing gear. His verdict was immediate. Total loss. The engine was destroyed, bearings seized, cylinders scored, everything cooked by impossible altitude and extended emergency power. The propeller was beyond repair. The hub was cracked. The airframe carried stress damage throughout. No rebuild. No return to service. They would strip it for instruments, radios, anything salvageable, and scrap what remained. The Corsair that brought down the Nick would be gone within days. Intelligence officers arrived almost immediately. Regulations demanded a formal statement within hours because the details mattered to everyone still flying. Klingman described the entire fight, the climb to 38,000 feet, the guns freezing, the decision to use the propeller, 3 separate strikes, the tail tearing off, and the absence of parachutes as the enemy fell with its reconnaissance data. The questioning became precise: altitude when the guns locked up, estimated air temperature, the Nick's speed, its defensive armament, the crew count. Klingman's report matched Reusser's witness statement, and the victory was confirmed. 1 Ki-45 Nick destroyed, no survivors, no photographs delivered. Mission accomplished. It was Klingman's 3rd confirmed kill, and the only one achieved by turning a propeller into a weapon. The squadron commander recommended him for the Navy Cross. The citation would emphasize what mattered. He chased the enemy beyond his own aircraft's limits, improvised when standard weapons failed, destroyed a reconnaissance plane before it could deliver intelligence, and likely prevented future attacks guided by that data. Before anything else, he had to be checked. After roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes of extreme stress, the flight surgeon examined him. Elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, dehydration, minor frostbite on his fingers from the cold at altitude. Nothing severe enough to ground him. 2 days later, he flew again. On May 12th, during a routine patrol with no enemy contact, his aircraft developed a hydraulic failure and the landing gear wouldn't extend. He bailed out at about 5,000 feet over the ocean. A destroyer recovered him after roughly 30 minutes in the water. Wet, cold, unhurt, he was back at Kadena and flying again the next day. VMF-312 kept flying daily missions through June. Ground support, combat air patrol, kamikaze interceptions. By June 22nd, when Okinawa was declared secure, Klingman had logged 78 combat missions. He never repeated the propeller attack, but the May 10th fight became the story everyone remembered. The Navy Cross arrived in July, and the citation described extraordinary heroism, disregard for personal safety, pursuit beyond aircraft limits, and improvisation when guns failed, destroying a reconnaissance aircraft before its intelligence could reach Japanese commanders, and potentially saving American lives. Afterward, pilots studied the episode. Could that technique work again? Maybe, under very specific conditions. Extreme altitude where guns could freeze, against a slower reconnaissance aircraft when the tactical situation left no other choice. But it demanded perfect control, perfect timing, and a willingness to accept enormous risk. Few would ever try it. Klingman did it because he saw no alternative. The war ended on August 15th when Japan surrendered. VMF-312 stayed on Okinawa into September as part of occupation duties. Klingman flew his final combat mission on August 10th, an uneventful patrol 5 days before surrender. The shooting war was nearly over. but the May 10th mission had already defined his service. He returned to the United States in October 1945 at 28 years old. By then, he'd survived 78 combat missions, earned 3 confirmed kills, the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals, and had bailed out twice. He had also made a powerless landing once, and had used his propeller as a weapon once. Most pilots never faced even one of those experiences. He lived through all of them in roughly 6 months. He married his girlfriend in San Diego, named Jackie Cochran, not the famous aviator, but a different woman who happened to share the name. She had waited through the war. Klingman kept the parachute from the May 12th bailout, and she turned it into her wedding dress, white silk that carried its own quiet reminder of how close he'd come. Klingman stayed in the Marines after the war, helping build the post-war force and mentoring younger pilots. He moved through new aircraft types, taught what Okinawa had taught him, how altitude changes everything, how cold can disable weapons, and how improvisation sometimes becomes the only path when standard tactics fail. Then Korea erupted in June 1950. Communist forces invaded South Korea and the United Nations responded. Klingman deployed as a forward air controller with the 1st Marine Division. Different job, same stakes. He coordinated close air support for Marines on the ground, marking targets with smoke, talking pilots onto coordinates, directing strikes often close to friendly positions. Work where a small mistake could kill Americans.
You served in that role for 13 months and brought his people home alive, earning another Air Medal for his career service, before returning to the United States in 1952.
He continued serving through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, training more pilots and carrying the lessons forward. He rose to lieutenant colonel. His career ran 32 years, from 1934 to 1966, spanning the Depression, World War II, Korea, and the early Cold War. From enlisted drummer to field-grade officer. He retired in 1966 at 49 and moved with his wife to Hawaii, settling in Kihei on Maui. He earned a private pilot license and kept flying small civilian aircraft around the islands. After everything, he still loved the sky. He rarely spoke about May 10th, 1945. His family knew the broad altitude, high altitude, propeller attack, Navy Cross, but he didn't chase attention. The fuller story became widely known through historians, squadron records, witness statements, and the Navy Cross citation. Over decades, aviation enthusiasts and analysts studied what he'd done. The propeller strike became a case study in the extremes of naval aviation and the brutal arithmetic of combat choice. Robert Klingman died on July 6, 2004, in Kihei, Hawaii, at 87 from complications following a stroke. His wife survived him, as did his children and grandchildren. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 60 with full military honors, a flag-draped coffin, a Marine Honor Guard, rifle salute, and taps. His marker lists his decorations: Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals with devices, facts carved in stone in the Marine way. And yet, that May 10th mission still stands apart in aviation history. No other pilot is known for deliberately using a propeller as a precision weapon at extreme altitude, making 3 calculated strikes, surviving the fight, and bringing himself home. That day proved more than courage. It proved that pilots would push beyond design limits to complete an objective, that machines can be forced past their intended envelope, briefly, when the alternative is disaster, and that improvisation can matter as much as firepower when standard weapons fail. The NIC never delivered its photographs. The coordinators never received that intelligence, and ships that might have burned the next day got another sunrise instead. If this story hit you the way it hits anyone who hears it, help it travel. Leave a like so more people get shown these forgotten chapters, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, across the US, Australia, Canada, or anywhere else. Because this community exists for one reason: to keep real history and real names from disappearing. If someone in your family served, share them too. Thank you for watching and for helping make sure Robert Klingman and thousands like him are not forgotten.